So you're buying a house or maybe some land. Do you need a survey? Stick around. I think you do. Hey everybody, it's Chad Camp, your Alabama land agent. And this tip of the week is, yes, I would absolutely get a survey. Everything I've ever purchased, I've always got a survey because I like to know what I'm buying. And the only reason not to get a survey if one's done in the last few years, but even then, I still highly recommend getting a surveyor to look at it, as well as maybe have the property corners marked so that way you at least understand that survey. So we're going to talk about 5 things that I think the reason why you need to know. Obviously is acreage. You need to know about encroachments. You need to know about any utilities underneath the ground, which will come about with an Alta survey. The other thing would be is property line discrepancies, and the last thing is floodplain, and also knowing where the floodway is. So those 5 things would be very important. So let's continue on and find out more about why you need to know, or why you need to have a survey. The most obvious reason having a survey is to determine the amount of acreage on the property, and that's a given. I mean, everyone understands that you'd like to know the acreage, and in some parts the acreage does change. You know, what if you're on a big creek or a big river that has a tremendous amount of water flow that comes through? Well, the banks erode away. So, I mean, acreage can change sometimes too. So that's the most obvious is acreage. The next reason why you would want to have a survey is an encroachment. And you're saying, what is an encroachment? An encroachment is something, what could be a structure of a building, it could be a fence, it could be a piece of water like a pond that's been built across your property line. And believe it or not, it does happen. You know, they start out with good intentions and it ends up being differently. Probably the single biggest encroachment that's 99% of the time is going to be a fence. People don't know where the property lines are to put a fence. Think about it. You think about old farmers and farms that has a farmer whose property stopped short of their property on their side, and then the neighbor says, hey, do you mind me butting up to your fence? It would save me some money, so I'm going to cross your property line and actually join your fence. Well, that's okay. You know, farmers did it back then to help other farmers, you know, to save money, and that's great. But here's the problem. They didn't sign a boundary agreement that was recorded. And so what happens if it's not a public record, when farmer A gets ready to sell his property, the one that was willing to let the other farmer come across gets ready to sell his property. Let's just say, for instance, he died and his wife gets it. Well, if there's no agreement, she doesn't know the conversation. She doesn't know anything that's happened, and the other farmer does. Let's say, but he dies too. Well, there's no transfer of information there. There's none. What happens is they get ready to sell, they survey the property, and this has been 20, 30 years later, and they survey the property. Well, the other farmer that was given the permission to do that, kids, says, whoa, wait a minute, that survey is not right. Our property is to the back of that fence line. Well, they will win in court because there's not a boundary agreement and there's nothing in writing. It's just hearsay. It's just words that were spoken between two parties. They'll win. A fence will always win a court case about boundary lines. So be careful. If you got a deal like that, you need to get something written in an agreement. That's a common problem is the fence. Another problem is houses. We've seen houses that people didn't survey the footings, the layout, and they decide to either put a manufactured home across a property line or build a house. That happens. that's just not happened to houses too. It's structures like barns and barns and other structures. That happens all the time, and you think, well, what else could possibly? Ponds is another thing. A lot of times when they get ready to build their pond, they don't really have a good idea how far out that pond's going to fill up. Sometimes it fills up and goes beyond that area because of the amount of water, and depending on the dam too. So we've seen situations where ponds have been an encroachment, and there's other types of encroachments, but these are probably the most common that you might find on a rural type property. So that's an encroachment. You got it, and that's a good reason why to get a survey, is to know if you have any encroachments. The third reason to get a survey is for utilities. Sometimes there are buried utilities that are not marked and that are unclear how they cross the property. And it may be very important. It's very important in commercial projects, and they do what they call an ALTA survey. And the ALTA survey actually shows all the setbacks that are recorded. It shows all the easements, whether it be underground easements, gas easements, water line easements. There's some power line easements that crosses the property. It shows the width of them sometimes, and they put all that on a survey, and then that kind of tells you your footprint area that you have that's actually workable and feasible. Well, what if you bought a piece of property that was on a power line and you didn't know how wide that power line or maybe that gas line was? Maybe there was another gas line, it went a different direction, and a lot of times they'll have markers going across the property indicating that, but you always can't go by that because they can disappear. So if that's one reason why having a survey, or at least having the title ran, and then taking the title and that information that's been recorded and actually having it imposed upon the survey. That way you know what you've got to work with. The fourth thing is property line discrepancies. And this is another case where it can come up in title work. And what that means is there may be a gap. There may what they called in surveying like a hiata, where there's a gap between the two property owners, and there's not really clear who actually owns that piece. It's just like a gap that nobody understands or knows who owns it. That's one thing. The other case is sometimes there's property lines that's unclear, where nobody has a good legal description. A lot of these older descriptions, it says, the northeast quarter of this north-southeast quarter, and if all the neighboring descriptions are like that, it's not real clear what's and who's what, and especially if it's all been sold and then sold again to a neighbor because they didn't go through a title company or through an attorney, and it perpetuates and goes on through many years, and then somebody goes to do a survey and get title work, and then it's unclear. So a lot of times you need a survey to really identify exactly the property lines, and actually then you may have to get with an attorney to actually publish it, make sure there's no one that's going to come out and dispute the actual property, and to fix the lines through that way. So there's always property line discrepancies that could happen, and that's something that you want to know. And two, having a survey is a good way to put somebody on alarm that you own that property. Remember the fence situation what I was talking about earlier? It's a good way to have that done prior to purchasing and let it sit out there before you close, because if there's any problems, most of the time it may not happen in a wooded tract, but it could happen in a pasture tract where it's open and visible to the adjoining property owners. So if there is an issue, they'll bring it up before you get to closing, especially if you're buying this property. So that's the fourth thing that I'd be careful about too. The fifth and last thing that I would say is important about surveys and using surveys as far as floodplains and floodways. There is a difference. You can actually build in a floodplain area. You just have to build it up, either building up the dirt there by bringing in a lot of chert and building a good base up to the elevation to get the house out of the floodplain, or actually going in there and putting a home on stilts like you see at the beach, or that you see down on the river in the bottom land areas along rivers and lakes and that sort of thing. But the other thing you need to know about is floodways, which you cannot build in. You can't build in a floodway, but you can a floodplain. And it's good to have that, to know where it is, because that also reduces the amount of area that you can actually use too, depending on how important that is to you in your property purchase, is knowing where the floodplain is, where it would stop, and especially, most importantly, what you can't build in is a floodway, and obviously you'd want to know that as well. So those are some things. If you have any questions or concern, maybe you've had a bad experience. If you had a bad experience with a survey or an issue that you had to get a survey to correct, it'd be very interesting to know, and please comment below there. And again, we always appreciate you watching the videos. If you have any questions, give me a call. Thanks again.